I realize it's hard for most of Jehovah's Witnesses to come to grips with the fact that the Watchtower has misled you. No, not in the way that the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses say, or those who say that Jehovah's Witnesses are antichrist because we don't believe in the Trinity and all of that sort of nonsense. But the Watchtower has undeniably misled Jehovah's Witnesses in regards to the coming of Christ. I didn't wake up one morning and come to this realization and decide to start up a website and expose the Watchtower. But I did wake up one morning and I started reading the Bible. Let me qualify that. I'd always been a Bible reader. I became one of Jehovah's Witnesses back in the 1970s, and I kept up with all the weekly Bible reading and the Bible study aids. In fact, I was an elder and a pioneer for a number of years. But one day, about 20 years ago now, I developed an insatiable hunger to read the prophets. And some days I would spend hours reading the prophets. Ezekiel, I think I started off with, and then Isaiah, and I read them over and over and over again. And that went on for many months and into over a year. It seemed, at the time, I had a pretty good idea of what I was reading, but I read them over and over again to sort of verify that the way I was seeing it made sense, and testing it out. And I suppose I'm still doing that with this website. But it became apparent to me as time went on that Jehovah had opened my mind up to things that were concealed before, and concealed to nearly everyone else as far as I can tell. And of course he did that for a reason. I gradually realized that I had an assignment that was to present Jehovah's judgments as contained in the prophecies to the public to a lesser extent, but primarily to the leadership of the Watchtower and to Jehovah's Witnesses at large. The judgments of Jehovah being his pronouncements as contained in the Holy Scriptures directed to the people who bear his name. Isn't that the way it worked in the Bible times? The Jews were God's people, were they not? And yet Jehovah entered into judgment with them, actually for the very reason that they were his people. As it says in Amos, he said, "Only you have I known out of all the families of the ground. And that is why I shall have to call you to account for all of your sins." Well, the Watchtower is aware of the fact that there is a judgment of the Christian organization as well. And it occurs with the coming of Christ. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses are absolutely convinced that Christ came in 1914. And the Watchtower has constructed a rather elaborate prophetic exegesis and explanation of how all the prophecies actually have been fulfilled for the most part. For example, the Christian apostle Peter foretold that judgment begins first with us, with the house of God. And the prophet Ezekiel showed that to be the case, that judgment starts with the temple of God. And in this instance, the temple of God is Christ's congregation. Well, the Watchtower teaches that began back in 1914. And the turmoil that the Bible students went through, and Rutherford being hauled off to the Atlanta penitentiary with 7 other Bethelites. That was the fulfillment of really dozens of these prophecies of Jehovah's judgment. And then when they were released from prison, then they got out of Babylon the Great. And Jehovah's Witnesses have gotten out of Babylon the Great on an individual basis, you might say, as they've gotten out of the churches. But that's not the way the prophecies were fulfilled originally, and it's not the way the picture they foreshadow in the future. We know that Jehovah used ancient Babylon as his instrument for punishing his wayward people. He warned them and warned them and warned them, and then the punishment came. But then he also showed them mercy, and he sent his anointed one, King Cyrus, the Persian, who obviously prefigures Jesus Christ. And he toppled Babylon and released the Jews from their captivity and restored them to their homeland. They weren't released individually, and their release, as it said in prophecy, was the end, because when they went back to their homeland, they made it a paradise. And it was the development, the beginning of the new heavens and the new earth. Again, the Watchtower says all of that has already taken place back in 1914, 1918, 1919. You know what I'm talking about. It's interesting. The old New World Translation used the expression that Paul used writing to the Thessalonians about a man of lawlessness and how God would let an operation of air go to those who knew the truth, to test their love for the truth. Well, the newly revised New World Translation uses a slightly different expression, which I think is really more appropriate. It uses the expression a deluding influence. And according to the context, that deluding influence is what Paul warned the brothers about when he said, do not be quickly shaken from your reason as regards the announcement that the day of Jehovah is here or the presence has begun. He said, even if you receive weighty letters as though from us and announcements, he said, it will not come unless the apostasy comes first. The Watchtower has it all figured out here, don't they? The Watchtower says that the apostasy occurred 1,700 years ago with the introduction of Christendom. Constantine became basically the de facto head of Christianity. But that isn't really, for one thing, it doesn't fit with what Paul was saying, that this apostasy would be preceded by these announcements that the day of Jehovah is here, which, as I've pointed out over and over and over again, that's the Watchtower's message, and it has been from the very beginning. As many of you know, the Watchtower used to teach for more than half a century that the presence began in 1874. And even long after 1914, they still believe that the presence of Christ began in 1874. I think up until 1940, and then they revised a few things. Even as they continue to revise things now, this generation will not pass away. Or the more recent revision about when the slave receives the appointment from the master over all of his belongings, and when it is that the wise and foolish virgins part ways. So I won't go into all that, but so much on this website does go into that. And I've delved into the prophecies in Isaiah and Ezekiel, Daniel, virtually all the prophets, and gone through what the Watchtower teaches and show the error of that teaching for the purpose, not wrecking the faith of Jehovah's Witnesses and their watchtower, but to point forward to a future day of reckoning. I think if you think about it soberly, if there is a future judgment of God's people, of the house of God, then that is a very profound thing, because Jehovah's Witnesses believe it's a done deal. It's a thing of the past. And it's like Jesus said. When viewing Jerusalem, he says, my people did not discern the time of their being inspected. You did not discern the time of your being inspected. And it had a tragic end for the Jews, didn't it? Well, one of the prophecies that I took special interest in, and still do, is in the 28th chapter of Isaiah. And I'll just briefly read a few things there and comment. The 28th chapter refers to this army of Jehovah that he has appropriated. He said, look, this is in the second verse, Jehovah has someone strong and mighty, like a thundering hailstorm, a destructive windstorm, like a thunderstorm of powerful floodwaters. He will forcefully hurl it down to the earth. What will he hurl down to the earth? Well, he's referring to his organization. That's why he says, woe to the showy crown of the drunkards of Ephraim. Well, going on down a few verses, verse 5, this indicates that this judgment applies to God's people, because it says, in that day Jehovah of armies will become a glorious crown. Prior to his becoming a glorious crown, an organization had his glorious crown. And Jehovah used an earthly agency to throw it down. And he will do so in the future, as I'll point out in a minute. But in that day, Jehovah of armies will become a glorious crown and a beautiful garland to those left of his people. To those left of his people. There is a judgment, a separating of the wheat and the weeds. Evil slave, good slave. Wise and foolish virgins. Sheep and goats even, eh? And he will become a spirit of justice to the one who sits in judgment, and a source of mightiness to those who repel the attack at the gate. But even those at that time who stand up for the truth, we may be sure they're anointed ones of Christ, these also go astray because of wine. Their alcoholic beverages make them stagger. Priests and prophet go astray because of alcohol. The wine confuses them, and they stagger from their alcohol. Their vision makes them go astray, and they stumble in judgment. Well, as Paul said, there is a deluding influence. And here, Isaiah is not talking about literal alcohol, literal wine. The Watchtower knows that, and of course they apply it to the clergy. But really the wine is the truth. The truth, knowing the truth, can make a person heady, overconfident. Isn't that what happened to the Jews? Jehovah said that Jerusalem was the place where he caused his name to reside, and there was his temple. He'd already repelled the Assyrian invasion. You recall that Sennacherib sent his spokesman there and told the Jews to capitulate. No nation has stood before the Assyrian juggernaut. Just come out with your hands up. And Jehovah's angel went out and snuffed out the entire Assyrian army. 185,000 soldiers went to sleep one night, apparently, and didn't wake up. So the Jews felt like Babylon will never take this city. We have Jehovah on our side. Remember in Jeremiah, the Jews were saying, the temple of Jehovah we are. Well, that temple of Jehovah that one time he spared, a few hundred years later, he destroyed it. And that's really a similar attitude of Jehovah's Witnesses. We have the truth. We're in the truth. We're God's people. Everyone else is on the outside. The faithful and discreet slave will show us the way. And priest and prophet go astray from the alcohol, from the truth, from the headiness of knowing the truth. Doesn't the Watchtower claim to be the prophet, the Isaiah class, or the Ezekiel class of prophet, the Micah class, the Jeremiah class, and on and on, and the priests of Jehovah? And they are functioning in that capacity. Well, here it says, priest and prophet go astray. And dropping on down, Jehovah takes issue with them because the leaders of his people say, we have made a covenant with death, and with the grave we have made an agreement. When the raging flash flood passes through, it will not reach us, for we have made a lie our refuge, and we have hidden ourselves in falsehood. Again, the deluding influence, the falsehood that Christ came in 1914, and that he's using this organization, and that following this organization is all you have to do, will lead you right into the promised land. Well, how will Jehovah deal with those who've hidden themselves in falsehood? The very next verse. And this indicates that we're talking about the coming of Christ. And it could not have been in 1914. Verse 16, therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah says. Here I am laying as a foundation in Zion a tested stone. Christ has been tested, has he not? The precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. No one exercising faith will panic. And I will make justice the measuring line, and righteousness the leveling tool. The hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will flood out the hiding place. The Watchtower is on record, repeating over and over and over, that the next thing to happen will be the destruction of Babylon the Great by the United Nations. Yet there's no indication anywhere in the political world that the United Nations has the will or the power to do such a thing. Now, that's not saying that they will not at some point in the future. But the Watchtower insists, and Jehovah's Witnesses have no choice but to believe it, that the next order of business on the prophetic calendar is this sudden destruction of all organized religion around the world by this eighth king of Revelation. But according to the prophecies, the next order of business is the crash of the political system. And that crash will lead to the rising of that eighth king and the imposition of a global government, a tyrannical government, probably a communistic system. And the work of Jehovah's Witnesses will come to a screeching halt, something that is completely unanticipated. In that way, the hailstorm will flood away their place of concealment. Their 1914 thing it will be gone. It will be obvious that the whole thing was a falsehood. when Christ comes in the future, in the immediate future, it will set off all the things that the Watchtower insists happened in 1914 that cannot be repeated, such as World War. And we're on the edge of a world war. Anyone who can't see that may be drinking too much wine, eh? Figuratively. So, unfortunately, for me anyway, there's no reward in my case for being right, but I have my assignment, and as long as Jehovah keeps giving me breath, although it is getting a little short these days, you might hear me wheezing. No, seriously. My work is to announce that the next order of events on the calendar, the Watchtower has their prophecies laid out. From my perspective, we're looking at the immediate arrival of Christ to initiate the parousia and the judgment against the backdrop of world war, pestilence, earthquakes, food shortages, all the things that the Watchtower says took place in 1914. And once they begin, then obviously there will be no denying. But the question is, will you have the faith not to panic? As it says in Isaiah, no one exercising faith will panic. And Jesus actually told us, do not give way to terror, because the world is going to be terrified. Believe me, when they start setting off nuclear weapons, cruise bombs and missiles and all this arsenal that they have, it is going to be terrifying. And the Watchtower is not going to be there to hold your hand. I won't read the next chapter, but he refers to, instead of Ephraim, he refers to Ariel. And he says, from the dust, your own voice will arise. Like a spirit medium, you'll chirp from the ground. So not a very robust presence. It's like speaking from beyond the dead, trying to have influence. That's about all I have for now.